Content warning. This video will be discussing heavy subject matters with a focus on abusive relationships and physical violence. Stay safe and feel free to sit this one out if you need to. In the Season 3 episode of the show Transformers Prime titled Thirst, Knockout the Decepticon Medic and Starscream the second-in-command are working on a project involving a synthetic energy source when they end up accidentally creating what essentially amounts to robot zombie vampires. It's complicated, don't worry about it, and I promise it's much scarier in show. At the end of the episode, once everything is finally handled, they have to report to their superior and leader of their faction, Megatron. As punishment for working with Starscream against Megatron's orders, all of Knockout's projects are given to another Decepticon scientist, essentially demoting him.
And as for you...
Megatron begins, and the camera cuts to Starscream. Starscream begs,
Lord Megatron, if you will just allow me to explain things.
But Megatron interrupts him.
No. Allow me to explain things.
Megatron says, clenching a fist and beginning to advance on him.
In a manner which I know you'll understand.
Spotlight Megatron was number 29 in IDW's G1 Transformers Spotlight run. Megatron returns to the Decepticons that he'd left in Starscream's charge to find that they're in shambles, a shadow of what they'd once been as an army. He seeks Starscream out, and over the course of a few pages, verbally berates him for what has happened during his tenure as leader, thinking to himself, this won't be any sport at all, when Starscream responds by cowing rather than biting back. Megatron continues to egg his second-in-command, eventually culminating in the lines, I hope it was everything you'd wished for, because this is what it's like when you get what you want. All hail Starscream. You must be very proud. This is what finally causes Starscream to snap, lashing out and begging him to stop, giving Megatron the, quote, excuse that he'd needed to physically beat him and continue to verbally berate him for the next 12 pages of a 21-page comic. The first thing I thought of when I woke, says Megatron's inner monologue, was I cannot wait to beat the ever-living spark out of Starscream. I would exert my dominance and we would move on. You don't seek oblivion, you seek punishment, he tells Starscream towards the end of this, and once Megatron has decided that Starscream has had enough, he turns towards the rest of his troops and gives a speech to rally them. If you went back and watched the original Transformers cartoon, you wouldn't find a dynamic like this between Megatron and Starscream. What they had was mutually snarky, sure. Starscream would jump at any chance he had to be leader, absolutely. But the tone between them, like the tone throughout the rest of the show, was lighthearted. Starscream is a serial backstabber, but it was fun, and the worst Megatron would do is throw an Energon cube at his head out of absolutely nowhere.
You disgust me.
There wasn't the kind of underlying toxicity that we see now. Hey there, fellow aliens, this is your alien boyfriend. And somewhere in the translation to more modern, more mature adaptations from what we had in G1, something about Starscream and Megatron's dynamic was changed. But even though this new dynamic turns Megatron into a figure of oppression in Starscream's life, why does the narrative still treat Starscream as if he's the one in the wrong? This essay will be primarily focused on the aligned and IDW continuities. Most discussion of Megatron and Starscream's portrayals will be pulling from those two sources. That said, let's talk about Imperfect Victims, Imperfect Narratives, and the implications all of this holds. Part 1. Defining Abuse. It's important to start this off by saying that there is a difference between regular violence and insults and abuse. When abuse is talked about in fandom spaces, especially younger fandom spaces, a lot of things tend to get called abuse that just aren't. Or best case scenario, aren't unless interpreted in a very specific, very subjective way. While physical assault and insults are not good, and they are indicative of an unsavory personality, they are not necessarily abuse unless part of a larger pattern of behaviors. For the purposes of this video, I will be defining abuse as bringing physical or psychological harm to the victim in a pattern that is regularly recurring and cyclical or semi-cyclical in nature, with the end goal of exerting control over the victim or their actions. That said, what do I mean by cyclical? The abuse cycle, or cycle of abuse, is a pattern most often recognized in abusive romantic partnerships, but also often applies to abusive familial relationships, and in this case, abusive professional relationships. The cycle can most easily be broken into 3 steps. Step 1, the honeymoon phase. In the honeymoon phase, as the name might suggest, everything is at the very least calm, if not outright good. Most abusive relationships begin at the honeymoon phase, as the abuser is hiding their true nature from their victim at this point, and want to paint a good picture of themselves. In an already established relationship, the honeymoon is used to either gaslight or manipulate the victim into believing that their relationship is not as bad as they might think. This is one of the myriad reasons that abuse survivors have a hard time leaving the horrific situations that they find themselves in. Their abusers, a good chunk of the time, are actively trying to make them think that they're one of the best things to ever happen to them. Step 2, tension. During the tension phase, things are not so pleasant. Arguments happen and the abuser's facade is beginning to crumble. Victims at this stage often feel like they're walking on thin ice. Step 3, abuse. This is where acts of abuse occur in whatever form they may take. Almost immediately after this, we cycle back to the honeymoon. Apologies or reparations are made and the wheel continues to turn. According to healthyplace.com, what abuse really means is control. When a truly abusive situation exists, it's because one party is seeking to control the other through abuse. The cycle of abuse doesn't always follow these steps in their exact order. Sometimes it will jump back and forth. But the base pattern of what is primarily a tool to control the abuser's victim is easy to spot when you look at an abusive relationship. With this definition, things like, say, Megatron killing Dreadwing in Transformers Prime was bad. It was, after all, literal murder. But it wouldn't be on par with his treatment of Starscream because it was not part of a larger pattern. Megatron had not exhibited abusive behaviors towards Dreadwing before. Starscream's actions towards Megatron, then, are also not abusive. Starscream has no power over Megatron, and thus cannot exert any kind of control. Part 2. Imperfect Victims. A lot of Starscream's characterization in the later stages of IDW's G1 reboot is built on the fact that he has an actual angel on his shoulder, in the form of Bumblebee's ghost, who only he can see. It's complicated, don't worry about it. In part because of Bumblebee's influence, Starscream starts to get better. He makes better choices, he starts to put the needs of his people before himself, he's also Emperor of Cybertron at this point, and because of that, he starts to make changes in himself. But as anyone who's dealt with trauma or mental illness before knows, recovery isn't a straight line from messed up to doing great. Starscream slips up and falls back into old ways more than once, and after a really big slip-up, Bumblebee confronts him, saying, "How long are you going to cling to this worn-out, narcissistic mask? Starscream the Ruthless, the Grand Schemer. You haven't been that, just that, for a long time now. People expect things of you because they believe in you, and that should be something you're proud of, not something you're determined to destroy. Why is it so important for you to be alone?" Starscream's response to this is one of the most heartbreaking things I've ever read. He says, "Because I am alone. Because the nanosecond I forget that life, most often in the shape of Megatron, beat the truth back into me. Literally." When we talk about abuse, we often picture the survivors in a very certain way, whether we mean to or not. We trend towards depictions of abuse survivors as meek or physically weak in some way, suffering in silence at the hands of monsters. So when abuse survivors are shown in a different light, there's often an almost visceral reaction. If the survivor is depicted as fighting back or even killing their abuser, then the survivor's status as a victim of abuse is suddenly called into question. If the survivor is angry or volatile or, God forbid, violent towards their abuser, retaliating against the person that caused them so much pain, then suddenly, for many people, they're seen as just as bad. Suddenly, for many people, they deserve what they're receiving. Lest I be called some sort of apologist or compared to one of those villain fans that's up and ready to dismiss any bad things their loves have done just because they like them, I do want to say that Starscream is not a good person in Shattered Glass notwithstanding most iterations of Transformers. He does show the potential to be in Prime, IDW, and Armada, and a lot of the most interesting parts of his character in these continuities kinda hinge on that. But on the whole, he's selfish, he's self-serving, he's duplicitous, he's maniacal, he's vain, and these are not the kind of words you use to describe someone most people would consider good. But his goodness, or lack thereof, is not the point. There's actually a lot of contention in parts of the Transformers fandom about this, and I mean, to the point that I was once called a Starscream apologist just for bringing up the fact that he was abused in TFP without saying literally anything else about him. Like, I'm full and well aware that I'm gonna get some side eyes for this topic of choice. But we talk about Starscream, and the same point inevitably comes up from someone in the discussion. Doesn't he just bring all this on himself? The short answer, no. The long answer, in IDW G1, Starscream began his working relationship with Megatron in complete awe of him, to the point that he even cried when he first met him. He idolized Megatron. So what caused the shift in the way that he viewed him? In Prime, we don't really get to see the beginning of their relationship. But in both continuities, Megatron is clearly shown to be Starscream's biggest fear and gets brought up whenever Starscream is nervous or paranoid. Megatron has traumatized him in both continuities. So why in that case would anyone ask if he's brought it on himself? Why do we get stuck in this rhetoric saying that anyone who's angry or violent or anyone who fights back must deserve the pain that they've been put through? Saying this character is a bad person and this character was abused and traumatized for literally centuries if not millennia and didn't deserve that aren't mutually exclusive statements. For the record, no one deserves abuse. No one deserves torture or trauma. It doesn't matter how bad of a person they are. Framing Starscream as in the wrong for all of Megatron's wrongdoings is not only gross, it's grossly missing the point. But I suppose a lot of the fandom's reaction to Starscream comes down to the way that the narrative frames him. Part 3, Imperfect Narratives. Something that can be hard for anyone to pick up on when they're consuming any piece of media is that oftentimes a story will show you one thing while telling you something else much more subtly. This sometimes contradictory information can be fed to you via the visual framing, the way other characters react to certain beats, the background music choices, in-story consequences, and that's just to name a few. This isn't a bad thing. In fact, more often than not, it's good. It allows the writers to sway their audience members certain ways when it comes to certain characters or plot beats. If a character is bad, it helps you to believe that they're bad if they receive consequences for their actions, or if they're shown looming over other people or always in shadow. And if, for example, you're told by the story that a certain character dying is a good thing, even if you liked that character, you're going to be inclined to believe it. Good writers use this to their advantage so that you get the story that they actually want to tell you, not the story that your brain would pick up by default. But as you might have already guessed, this can become a problem in certain scenarios, especially if the writer doesn't know or doesn't realize what exactly they're writing. And that, for the record, is what I think happened with Transformers Prime. I don't think the writers knew that they were writing an abusive relationship between Megatron and Starscream. I don't think that they were writing Starscream as an abuse victim on purpose, even if they did put in a lot of character traits that fall in line really well with real-life survivors of abuse. TFP was always meant to be a slightly more mature adaptation of Transformers canon, and I think that they thought that they were writing the natural, more mature progression of Megatron and Starscream's dynamic. So when the writers show Starscream being dragged away by his face by Megatron and frame it as comeuppance because that's what they thought it was, that's what a sizable chunk of the fandom is going to view it as. They're being told that Starscream brought this on himself, so they believe it. If you're wondering why I've kept my focus on TFP for this section so far, it's because IDW thankfully at the very least knew what they were writing. In post-Cybertronian war comic runs that feature Starscream as a focused character, he is written as a survivor. If someone reminds him of Megatron, he gets nervous. Megatron is shown to be his greatest fear. When another mech takes his shape specifically to scare Starscream, Starscream shrinks and cowers and panics, and you really get the sense that the writer gets exactly what is being portrayed there. Unfortunately, IDW did something else in a run without Starscream that undermines this almost entirely. Something that TFP also did. They both gave Megatron a redemption arc. Alright, yeah, feel free to boo me now. But hey, I'm not saying I don't like IDW Megatron's redemption arc. TFP's was barely there at all, so I won't even talk about that, but IDW's was well written. IDW Megatron was a freedom fighter originally that slowly became a monster, one with his own trauma that he was dealing with. And I like the idea that someone like him could learn to heal and become something at least resembling a good person. James Roberts did a wonderful job handling most of his arc. I want to make that really clear, and I want to make it really clear as well that I just love Megatron as a character in general. The actual problems I have with it personally are the narrative implications. See, Megatron regrets a lot of the things he did as the tyrant leader of the Decepticons. He regrets the cities he's raised, he regrets the people he's killed, he regrets the monsters he ended up making out of his own toxicity. But the one thing that he doesn't regret, the one person he still insults and sneers and talks down about, is Starscream. At least, if he does regret any of that, he's not giving us any indication of it. So now, we as an audience have a conundrum. In the series The Transformers, and then Till All Are One, among others, we have Starscream, and we're seeing the aftermath of Megatron's treatment of him and exactly how bad it all was. We're seeing Starscream essentially struggle with PTSD. But in More Than Meets the Eye and Lost Light, we have Megatron, now a good guy, now someone whose side that we're on, and he's still saying that Starscream deserves it all. Throughout the whole run, Megatron never once shows any ounce of remorse or guilt about Starscream, and he never gets the chance to apologize. If we're only reading Megatron's side, which a lot of people did, More Than Meets the Eye was one of the major draws to IDW, so a lot of people only read that, then that's the narrative we're being fed. We're being told one thing, and without Starscream there to show us the other side, what we're told is what a lot of us are going to believe. What's the point I'm getting at then, you might be asking? What exactly is this whole essay about? Well, let's talk about Part 4, the implications. If I have to name a scene that encapsulates basically everything I've been talking about, then let me tell you about the Season 2 episode of Transformers Prime titled Armada. This one is the biggest, it's complicated, don't worry about it in this video so far, so bear with me. So the basic premise is, Starscream defected from the Decepticons a while ago, but he's still trying to take over from the outside because Megatron sucks at leading. The problem is that because of reasons, he can no longer transform. Luckily, he finds an abandoned cloning lab, and he gets the bright idea to clone himself a small army and then send them to go kill Megatron. It doesn't work out that great for him, but that's neither here nor there. One of the clones, while aboard the Decepticon flagship, runs into the Autobot Bulkhead. And I want to make it really clear to anyone that doesn't know that the Autobots are the good guys in this series. They're the ones we're meant to be rooting for. Anyways, Bulkhead doesn't know this is a clone. He thinks it's the real Starscream, and he demands that Clone Scream tell him where the exit is. Clone Scream, having all of Starscream's absolutely wonderful and charming personality, refuses and threatens Bulkhead because, damn it, he has a mission he has to get done. He scratches Bulkhead's chest, emphasis on scratches. Bulkhead doesn't bleed, and I wouldn't even call it an actual injury, more of a paint scuff. Clone Scream, for all of his threats, has not proven himself a genuine threat to this giant hunk of metal. Bulkhead proceeds to beat him to death. Not shoot, beat. With his wrecking ball fist. Like, sure, working in character, Bulkhead doesn't really have any reason to feel sorry for Starscream at all, but that's messed up, right? On the meta level, the show shows Starscream going through really dire straits. He's lost his position in the Decepticons, he's starving, and he's just had his transformation mechanism taken from him, so he can't even do the thing he's most proud of anymore, which is flying. And then, after all of that, it shows us one of the characters we're meant to be rooting for killing him with his bare hands. I mean, a clone of him, but Bulkhead doesn't know that. And Bulkhead doesn't feel any remorse for it. He doesn't really show any guilt, and he doesn't get punished by the story for his actions. So that tells us, as an audience, that Starscream does deserve to die. Of course he does. The good guys say so. And if he deserves to die, then maybe he deserved everything else too. Maybe he deserved Megatron standing on his chest and pressing him into the floor to threaten him. Maybe he deserved Megatron threatening him with zombification literally minutes after returning from being in space for God knows how long, because Starscream dared to tell him, hey, maybe this isn't such a good idea. Maybe in the future he's gonna deserve Megatron literally invading his thoughts and mind to psychologically terrify him into complete submission for the rest of the series. Just as an example. The hot debate in fandom communities for the past few years has been the question of, does fiction affect reality, especially in discussions about certain topics in fanfiction that I won't talk about here because this is YouTube. And the real answer to that is yes and no. It's actually pretty complicated. But the basic gist is fiction does not one-to-one affect reality. If you watch someone kill someone else on TV, you're not gonna go out and commit murder, which is why so many arguments saying violent video games are dangerous are misinformed at best. Even in interactive media, the human brain has the capacity to distinguish fiction from reality, except in very specific circumstances. However, what fiction does affect is how we perceive the world around us, particularly the way we view other people and ourselves. If the media we consume is constantly showing certain groups of people in certain lights, it's hard not to internalize that. One of the things I read while researching for this was Racism and the Media by Kasia Kulasiewicz, and I am so sorry if I mispronounced that name, link to which will be in the description, which talks at length about the way media racial bias affects real-life microaggressions and stereotypes. While I'm not discussing racism here, the same principles can be applied to just about anything. Consume enough racist media, you internalize those beliefs unless you're actively trying not to, and even then you might still. Consume enough sexist or homophobic media and you internalize those beliefs as well. When we watch shows and movies with victims of abuse who are less than perfect as people, and who are shown as aggressive towards their abusers, and who actively fight back, and then we are told by the narratives portraying them that they deserve what's happening to them over and over and over again, that's what many audience members are gonna start to believe, whether that's the intent of the writers or not. And not just that. Survivors of abuse internalize these teachings as well, and they start to apply them to themselves. They start to believe that if they aren't paragons of virtue, and no one truly is, then maybe they did deserve it. They start to doubt their own feelings and experiences. They start to not want to fight back when someone oversteps their boundaries, just in case that's something bad for them to do. And in the long run, stuff like that can affect how we treat people and how we treat ourselves. For the record, no one deserves abuse. No one deserves that kind of pain or trauma. No one deserves the disorders abuse can give them and the panic you get stuck with for the rest of your life. And no one deserves to feel alone or be silenced when they try to talk about their pain. If you're in a bad situation, don't hesitate to reach out. There's a lot of resources out there that can help you get out if that's what you need to do. And if you're already out, there's a lot of resources that can help you cope. You're not alone. In conclusion, the purpose of this isn't to say Transformers Prime and IDW bad. Transformers Prime highly flawed despite what the fandom thinks, yes, and IDW a little misguided in some places, absolutely. No piece of media is perfect. Of course, we all know the one Transformers continuity that is completely beyond reproach. But really, what I am saying is that in trying to make Megatron and Starscream's dynamic more mature, there's certain things that you have to take into account while writing them. Namely, that Megatron has near absolute power over Starscream, Megatron is physically stronger than Starscream, and that if you write the relationship as having Megatron physically beat Starscream regularly, despite what Starscream may have done, and despite the fact that they're in the bad guy faction, or maybe because of it, that situation is gonna ring very close to home with real-life survivors of abuse. And you gotta be conscious of that. Even in the fandom itself, you've got to be conscious of that. Don't be surprised that so many people latch onto and identify with Starscream as a character when his narrative is beat for beat exactly what a lot of people have gone through in their own lives. So why does the narrative still treat Starscream like he's in the wrong? Because that's what the narrative thinks is true. And until we start to scrutinize our writing and fandom interactions when it comes to how we portray abuse, that's what the narrative is always going to think is true, even if it's not. If you like my content and you'd like to see more of me talking about fandom discourse I've been sitting on for literally 5 years now, don't forget to like and subscribe. If you have any suggestions for future videos or thoughts on this one, let me know in the comments. I may not respond to every comment, but I promise I do read all of them. My next video is meant to be a rundown of Animorphs as voted on by my Twitter poll, but hey, it's Pride Month, so I might do something else first just to do something themed, who knows. I'd like to give a shout out to my patrons over on Patreon: Fandom Musings, Jellicle Kitten, Ferrum Negative, Benjamin Wales, Antic, and Rowan. If you want to sponsor me on Patreon, I can be found at patreon.com/alienboyfriend, and that link is in the description. If you don't want to commit to a monthly pledge, one-time donations can be sent to my Ko-fi, which is ko-fi.com/alienboyfriend. Financially, my household hasn't been doing very awesome as of late, so every little bit helps. If you want to check me out on social media for updates or just to see what I'm doing, my Twitter is @alienboyfriend with a 3 instead of an E in alien, and my Tumblr is Attention Deficit Starscream. Special thanks for this video goes to my fiancée Faye and my best friend Robin for helping me with the research for this topic, as well as helping me get unstuck during the incredibly tricky writing process. Their social medias will be linked in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, Planet Cupid sends its love.